If you have a Bible with you, you might wish to turn it to the third chapter of 1 John. 1 John chapter 3. I bring you greetings from couples and a marriage weekend, a weekend workshop for marriages in crisis. My daughter Kimberly, who is in the front row here, and I've been working with those couples all weekend, all day Friday, all day yesterday. It'll be all the rest of the day today. Kimberly is in the middle of her marriage and family therapy master's degree and already in her intern counseling session, so we've added her to our workshop staff. So please understand when we leave just after services, we won't be able to stay for the auction, etc. I do understand that Jenny is going to auction off that if somebody bids enough, that I will actually preach in a Hawaiian shirt. That will start at $1,000. And you have to buy the shirt. Let's just put it that way. But I'm sorry we won't be here for that. We'll be going back to work with them. Let me go ahead and tell you about something that's going to be happening here, Lord willing, on the first Sunday of June, which, if I remember correctly, is the 2nd of June. My friend David Matthews lives in Searcy, Arkansas. David has become an expert in helping people deal with and overcome grief. Now, he does a workshop. As a matter of fact, the workshop they do is rather unique, but he does a workshop for people who are dealing with loss. Typically, it has to do with death, that I'm dealing with the death of somebody that I love very much. It sometimes deals with other kinds of loss, things that are very important to people, but not necessarily the death of a human being, like if you owned a company and you lost it. But most of it is about loss, dealing with somebody that you love and care about deeply. David is extremely gifted and very well versed and highly knowledgeable in helping people deal with loss. He's going to be here on the 2nd day of June, if I have that Sunday correct. It's the first Sunday in June, and he will be speaking that morning about that subject. I'll ask the Bible school teachers, as many as will, to, if you're willing to let your classes out that day, that we could also combine classes for as many of those teachers who are willing to do so, so that not only can you hear David speak, but you can also actually be able to interact with him, asking questions about this and that and the other. I know that what he does is extremely successful. It doesn't take all the hurt away, it doesn't take all the pain away, but it gives people the ability to move on, to get to a next level, to be able to cope with life in a better way. So it could be a person who's lost his or her health. Again, most often it's somebody who has lost somebody that they love. So not only am I encouraging you to be here that Sunday, but I'm encouraging you to bring people with you that Sunday who are dealing with loss. So that should be a Sunday where we pack the house, where we may have to bring more chairs out, where the fire marshal finally tells us we can't have any more people in here. Even bigger than an Easter Sunday. Not because Easter Sunday is not important, it obviously is, but you understand this subject's also important. And it may be the people that you know that don't have any connection to Christianity at all, maybe aren't part of any church whatsoever, would be people who would come with you that day, and David will bless them. God will bless them through David. Let me put that correctly. You'll like David. He's a dear friend, known him for a long period of time. Now, I'll probably mention that about every Sunday between now and then, so you can remember, and start thinking now of the people, that, if you will, that you will invite to bring with you that day. It'll be a very special day for us. 1 John chapter 3. In the epistle, by the way, that's fancy church language if you're not a church person. An epistle is a letter. In this particular letter that John wrote, he wrote a series of them, therefore they're called 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. In 1 John, he states several different reasons that he wrote the letter. Several different times in the letter, he said, I'm writing this because. The one I like best is not exactly in this verse, it's over in chapter 5, where he says, I'm writing this to you so that you may know that you have eternal life. Let me explain that just a minute. In Christendom at whole, or as in the big picture of Christendom, people tend to have different beliefs and views because sometimes the Scripture can be a little bit difficult to interpret. And when we have our different views, sometimes people wind up in different camps, if you will. Among the other divisions that exist sometimes among Christians, not divisions in that we hate each other or enemies, but the fact that we view some things differently. And there's a broad category called Calvinism or Calvinist and Arminians or Arminianism. Don't worry about those terms, they're not important to remember. Here's what you would remember about that. People who would be in the Calvinist camp, if you will, are people who believe that once you are saved, that you will never lose your salvation no matter what. It can't be lost. Then the people on the Arminian side of that, and again, you don't need to remember those terms. The people on the Arminian side of that are people who say, we're saved by God's grace, there's no doubt about that, but we can still choose during our walk to walk away. At some point in my life, I can just turn and give up my faith and leave God altogether and go away. And therefore, while I am saved, I can lose my salvation. Now, some people identify way over in that camp. Some people identify way over in that camp. And there's a lot of us kind of here in the middle. I remember talking to Steve Berger, who is the senior pastor at Grace Chapel over in Leapers Fork. And I asked him in our conversation, I said, are you Calvinist or Arminian? He said, I'm Calvarminian. I thought, I understand that because I think I am too. There are certain parts of this that make a lot of sense to understand. There's certain parts of that I believe and I understand. Unfortunately, in our fellowship, our tradition, our brotherhood, whatever phrase you want to use for us, there are many who have gone so far into the Arminian side that they just absolutely live in fear that they're lost. And so if you ask them a question like, are you saved? They'll say, I hope so. Will you go to heaven when you die? I guess I'll find out come Judgment Day. And that's a pretty miserable place to be. My next door neighbor is the pastor at Thompson Station Church, which is a Southern Baptist church, and Tom's a Calvinist. Tom says, once you are saved, you're saved. There is no doubt about it. He kids me a lot. He says, you guys believe once saved, may be saved. We're good friends. We have a lot of conversations in the driveway where we just pick on each other a lot about our different understandings of Scripture, but we do it as brothers, understand. And so in 1 John chapter 5, when he lists one of the reasons he wrote that epistle, that letter, and he says, I'm writing this to you so that you will know that you have eternal life. Now, in that context, throughout the book, he continually comes back to visit that. Even though he doesn't state it in chapter 5, throughout the book, he's constantly referring to things to help people realize that you can know that you're saved. Now, the reason that he has to keep emphasizing that is because anybody who has any sense at all knows that he or she is imperfect. Would that be a correct statement or an incorrect statement? Maybe I should just say it this way. If you are perfect, you probably would like to leave now because nothing else we're going to talk about will apply to you. I've often said back in ministry, if you're looking for a perfect church, this is not it. And when you find that perfect church, they're not going to take you. Nobody is perfect. So in 1 John chapter 3, as he's trying to help us understand about our salvation, even though we're imperfect, even though we're flawed, even though we sometimes mess up, that's where he begins in verse 11. This is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Now, let me explain who Cain is. If you're not familiar with the Bible, and that's fine. It's okay to come to church and not be familiar with the Bible. Well, it's our job to try to help teach the Bible. If you do come to church, it may be a story you haven't heard for a long time because it's way back in the Old Testament, and maybe we haven't heard it talked about except when we were in Bible class when we were kids. Cain and Abel were brothers. They'd made sacrifices to God. They were the descendants of Adam, the sons of Adam and Eve. And Cain's sacrifice was rejected by God, and Abel's was accepted. Cain became very upset about that. And rather than taking out his anger on God, which obviously would be a pretty bad thing to do, he took out his anger on his brother, and he killed his brother. Now, it's interesting that when he starts talking about love, he instantly illustrates from the negative side. And not only does he illustrate from the negative side, he illustrates about siblings. Because if you really want to understand love, I think that siblings is like the perfect way to look at what love is. When you try to understand all the ins and outs and the things that we say, these are good and these are not so good, the idiosyncrasies, all these things. Anybody here have any siblings? Anybody have any siblings that you thought a time or two, my parents should have had an only child? Okay. The little kids on the front row are going, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. The evil one here would be Satan. And why did you murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Look at the next verse. Do not be surprised, my brothers, if the world hates you. I'm going to go to that in just a section and explain what the world is. But let's just talk about siblings again for a minute. Now, you've had siblings, right? There are some siblings who love each other and some siblings, unfortunately, who absolutely hate each other. But let's just talk about for a minute the siblings that love each other. I'm assuming that at least some of us have siblings that we love. Would that be a correct assumption? Okay, the siblings that you love, has there ever been a time when you loved your sibling, but you were so frustrated with him or her that you just wish you could somehow do something to straighten them out? Anybody ever had a fight verbally with a sibling? Anybody ever had a fight physically with a sibling? You see, when I was a boy, my nose was small. My younger brother did this to me. I don't know how many times we fought. He was not nearly as big as me, but he was just a whole lot tougher. And he knew where to hit me, and he just got a bigger target every time we fought. And so there have been many times that we've had fist fights. Many, many times we had fist fights. Has anybody ever been to the point where you thought that your brother was not on your side, but on somebody else's side instead? Now, we played Little League ball. My older brother is 6 years older than I. When I say Little League ball, you must understand the little community where I grew up, we weren't actually part of the actual Little League because we didn't really fit all their rules. We're a little community, but we played against the other Little League teams. They saw us as the practice team to play against. My older brother, who is 6 years older than I, was our coach. Okay? So I'm like 12, he's like 18, something like that. I don't remember exact ages, and my younger brother, a year and a half younger than I, was on the team. A couple of cousins on the team. Actually, we were pretty good. We beat most of those guys. Of course, we did have some 20-year-olds on our team, but we beat most of those guys. I'll never forget one day in practice, I played catcher or first base. I really enjoyed catcher more. It was fun back there. They finally took me out because we didn't have equipment. Well, we actually had a face mask, but it didn't have a top, just from here down, which protected my nose, which at this point needed no protection any longer. Then one day I got knocked out when a foul went right into my skull, and I'm laid out there. So they put me on first base for a while because I didn't know which way was north. And so I'm playing first base in practice one day, and this woman whose children were on our team, she was a rather mean woman. I realize there are no mean women here, but this one was. Now, her son, one of her sons, had a severe eye problem, so he couldn't play. The reason he couldn't play was because when you hit that hard ball and it comes at you, if you can't see it, it could potentially be lethal. You understand that. But he would practice with us, and what he would do during practice is he would run the bases. And so they would hit the ball, and he would be the one who would run to first, and I'm playing first, and I actually heard his mother say, "Run over Joe." Now, he was twice my size, and he did. He ran slap over me, knocked me down. I jumped up, I was furious, but the guy's twice my size, and I'm thinking, okay. He goes back to run again because he's our base runner. I heard her say again, "Run over Joe." This happened 4 or 5 times in a row. Now, there's a couple of reasons I didn't hit him back. One is he was twice my size, but another is because I knew what my mother would do if she found out what that woman did, and I didn't want that to happen. And here was the major reason. My brother, my older brother, was our coach who was standing right there, hearing it all, and he didn't stop it. Never stopped it. How do you think a 12-year-old feels about his brother who apparently didn't protect him? What kind of emotions do you think that brother would feel? Now hold that story. I'm coming back to it in a few minutes. People who love each other sometimes disappoint each other. People who love each other sometimes let each other down. For example, have you ever said bad things about your sibling to somebody else? Okay, let me rephrase that question. Have you ever said bad things about your sibling to somebody else? Did it mean that you do not love him or her, or did it mean that you're human and sometimes in your frustration you just vent? Anybody ever vented? Ever? And it can be a bad thing. It certainly can, but it doesn't necessarily mean you don't love. It just means right now I'm frustrated or I'm angry or I'm hurt and I'm venting. And so I have vented about my brothers. I'm sure my brothers have vented about me. But did you guys love each other? There was a time when I wondered whether my older brother did. And it's ridiculous to think about this, but think it's from the mind of a child. I wondered if he loved me because he let Randy run over me again and again and again. You say, in the scheme of life, but I was a kid, you remember? And I really wondered about that for years. Does he really love me? Really? Now look at this verse. Do not be surprised, my brothers, if the world hates you. We know that we pass from death to life because we love our brothers. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Okay, he says it's one thing if the world hates you, but it's a different thing if your brother hates you. And what he's saying here is that Cain hated his brother. He said, don't think that you're in God's grace. Don't think that you're in God's light. Don't think you're in God's mercy and all those kinds of things if you hate your brother. And he's illustrating. What does that mean? Well, I'll give you the first example, murder. That'd be a pretty good indication of hate. He says, now, don't think that everybody's going to love you, that we're all talking about that. I'll guarantee you, if you stand up for God, I'll guarantee you, if you try to do what's right, the world will hate you. Not everybody in the world, not everything in the world, but enough of them. Am I right or not? Rick Warren's son. Anybody know who Rick Warren is? Pastor of Saddleback Church out in California. He wrote The Purpose-Driven Life. Did I get the name of that right? Which sold a gazillion copies. A gazillion copies. By the way, he didn't take any royalty from that book. None. He's had a great ministry, and among other things, he and his wife have been very involved in feeding hungry people in countries where there's great poverty. A couple of weeks ago, you may recall, it made all the news programs, his, 27-year-old son, who's had struggles with emotional and mental problems all of his life, committed suicide. You would think that the Christian community would just rush to Warren's side and put their arms around him, and we hurt with you. It's not surprising to us that some of the world attacked him viciously, saying things like, obviously this stuff you guys believe has no value, no power, because look what it did for your child. We don't like the fact that the world does that, but the world will hate you for standing up for things like that. It's amazing the people in the Christian community who attacked him. Oh yeah, online. Saying things like, well, if you preach the gospel the way it should be preached, your son wouldn't have done that. Or if you were a better man and not a hypocrite, your son wouldn't have. I mean, on and on and on. From people who were allegedly his brothers. Not part of his church, but part of the brotherhood of believers. You understand? I don't know Rick. I've never met Rick. Kimberly has. Kimberly knows him. Actually, in one forum, Kimberly questioned him about some things. Everybody else was intimidated. Not my daughter. So Kimberly knows him. I do not. Kimberly's met him, at least I haven't. But I'm quite sure if I could interview him today and say, which hurt, well, other than the death of your son itself, which obviously had to be devastating, which hurt more? The attacks from the world or the attacks from the brothers? I know the answer. Don't you? David said it this way in the Psalms. He said, if it had been an enemy, I could have stood it. But it was you, my brother. We had gone down to the house of God together. We know that we pass from death to life. Why? Because we love our brothers. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Now, that's the kind of passage you could read and go, I'm doomed, because sometimes I don't like my brothers. Anybody ever been there? Sometimes I get really frustrated with my brothers. Sometimes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he's going to go ahead and help us understand that. Look at the next verse. He says, verse 15, thank you, gentlemen. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer, by the way, even if you haven't killed them yet. He's saying if that kind of feeling is in your heart, God sees you that way. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life in him. Look at the next verse. This is how we know what love is. Okay, what do you mean? If you're going to start giving me some criteria that I can't possibly meet, then I'm going to think I don't love. And if I think I don't love, and I read these passages that says I have to love to be in the light, I have to love to be saved, I'm going to start doubting my salvation. You follow my logic here? So he says, I'm going to help you understand love in a way where it makes sense to you, because it's not always feeling these ooey gooey wonderful feelings about the other person. You can love a person that you're irritated with. You can love a person that you don't like what they're doing right now. You can love a person. Here's what he says. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. He wasn't feeling these ooey gooey warm fuzzy feelings when he died. As a matter of fact, the night before, he was begging his Father, if there's any other way, please don't make me do this. So he didn't go because he was looking forward to hanging on a cross. He went to the cross because it's what we needed. So it wasn't all these really wonderful positive emotions he was feeling at the time. His emotions were fear. He wanted to run. He wanted to abandon us. But the greatest act of love was that he didn't. That he didn't run. That he didn't abandon us. So love is not necessarily what you're feeling at a given moment, because feelings can fluctuate violently. It's what we do. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. Now, if you look at that and go, wow, the only way I can prove I love you is to die for you. No. He's going to explain that even more. So in the next verse he says, if anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Now, he just went from saying being willing to die for somebody, but that's a pretty rare and unique circumstance, don't you think? Most people are not going to have the opportunity to die for somebody else. He said, let me show you how this works in the real world. They're hurting. You can help. Do it. That's what love is. That's it. But what if I don't like them at the moment? Yeah, you're human. There's a guy who does a workshop with us. His name is Jeff King. Someday I'd like to invite Jeff King to come and preach here. You would really love listening to Jeff speak. If you're from the north, we'll have to interpret, because his southern accent is amazing. We had a couple from China go through our workshop. They spoke English, but the lady actually said to Jeff on the second day, do you speak English? Jeff just gives, and he doesn't let me pay him for doing the workshop, by the way. He comes and does it for free. And then he travels around the country based on his business, and he'll drop in and check on people. Oh, I'll give you a perfect example of who Jeff is. After that big hurricane that hit down in New Orleans area 3 or 4 years ago, there's so many I forget the names of them anymore. Jeff's biggest competitor in business was down there. His business was basically wiped out because of the hurricane. Jeff got a big truck, put several big tanks that held hundreds of gallons of diesel fuel, filled them up, put some other equipment on the trucks, drove down to the other guy's business, pulled up. The other guy didn't know he was coming, saying, I figure you need some of this stuff for a while. When you get it back, bring it back. Until then, there you go. He actually helped his competitor stay in business against him. He takes care of people all over America. People in our workshops, if he knows they live someplace, when he's driving, he'll stop by and see them. And Jeff does not like people. I'm telling the truth. You know Jeff. The reason he didn't make it as a preacher is because he's great in the pulpit, but at the back door you come up and you look at him and think, this man's going to hurt me. He just doesn't like people. But he loves them. He'll do anything in the world for you, then he wants to be alone. Just let me be by myself. He's full of love. Full of love. But it's not the ooey-gooey kind. Are you beginning to understand any of this at all? Maybe this will illustrate it, and then I'll end with my brother. Ever been through any kind of trouble? Anybody ever had some kind of a crisis since you were an adult? And the people that you thought would come to your side abandoned you? And the people that you thought were not your friends at all rushed to your side and stood there and took care of you? Anybody ever had an experience like that? That leads to this phrase. You've heard it. That's when you know who your real friends are. Have you heard that phrase? It's true. That's when you know who your real friends are. What do you mean? The ones that love me. Who are the ones that love me? Well, they may not like me. Sometimes they may say bad things about me behind my back. That's human nature. I probably said bad things about them too sometimes because I'm an idiot as well. But I'll go take care of them, and they'll come take care of me because we're brothers. And brothers sometimes disagree, and brothers sometimes fight. But they love each other, which means they stick together through thick and thin. That's what that passage is about. And here's what he's saying. If you're like that, you're in the light. If you're in the light, you're going to heaven. You're not perfect, but you're living a life of love. The people who don't love are the people who live in ultimate selfishness. Does that make any sense at all? So you're thinking, what about your brother, Joe? My older brother? Several years later, when I'm about in my mid-30s, so quite some time has passed, over 20 years, I got into trouble of my own making. My life fell apart. My two brothers, first of all, my younger brother came and got me, the one that used to break my nose all the time. He came and got me, put me in the truck and said, we're going home. I rebelled. I'm not going anywhere. I mean, I was broke. I didn't have a dime. I had nothing, but I was still proud. I'm not going anywhere. You know what he said? Think you can whip me now? So I got in the truck. Every time we ever fought, he whipped me. I figured he can whip me again. We went home. He gave me a job shoveling asphalt. I had spoken in various parts of the world. I'd spoken to very large audiences. I thought I was somebody until my life fell apart, which was my fault. My very, very wise young brother needed me to understand that my value was not being able to stand in front of an audience and speak, that I was no better than anybody else in the world. And he put me next to guys making minimum wage, shoveling asphalt in the Georgia sun. Comes out of that plant at 360 degrees. And down in that part of Georgia, it's a law that the temperature and humidity have to match. So you're at 95 degrees and 95% humidity, at least it feels that way, and you're shoveling that hot asphalt, and my brother was over there supervising, and he said, you say, well, he didn't love you much to make you shovel asphalt. Oh, it was the greatest act of love that's ever been, because he'd be showing me, son, you're not so hot. You're just one of us. By the grace of God, I was not very good at shoveling asphalt, so they had to move me to another position. So I wound up running one of their crews, finally. And this is my older brother now, who also co-owned that company with my younger brother. One day, one of the guys on my crews didn't like something I did. You have to understand, I've been ticking people off since birth. That's why the doctor slapped me when I was born. Ticked off one of the guys who worked for me, who was a pretty big guy, and he put the word out, I'm going to whip Joe. Now, understand that this was my older brother. Just understand this story. At this particular point, my older brother had not yet become a Christian. Since this time, since this story, he has, but not at this point, you understand. He put out the word, I'm going to whip Joe, one of the guys who worked for me. Now, it's a lot different to get whipped when you're 12 and when you're 35. Would you understand the difference in those deals? I'd heard about this later. I didn't witness it. They said my older brother, who was known for having a pretty bad temper, pulled up on the job site where the other guy was, got out of his truck, left the door open, and walked over, got in the other guy's face, who was also twice my older brother's size, and said, if you touch my brother, I will kill you. Turned and got in his truck and drove off, and nobody took that as a metaphor. Because of his temper and the way he was living at the time, everybody thought, he'll do it. He'll actually do it. Now, I don't want my brother killing anybody. But I had to rethink things. When I was 12, he let a guy run over me repeatedly. I'm an adult, he's willing to go to the penitentiary for me. What changed? Nothing. Not a thing. I finally figured it out. He knew what our mother would do to that woman if he made a deal out of that scene that day. And he knew all the results were going to happen to all of these families. And at 18, he was a lot wiser than I was at 12. And he figured, you're not really getting hurt, and I'm not going to let this escalate into something that causes a lot of damage. But we didn't talk about it, you understand? Now, since then, he's become a Christian, so hopefully he's not threatening to kill people anymore. If he is, I'm not aware of it. But he's my brother. You still argue about things? Yes, because he's not any smarter than he was before. My brothers and my sister, we will always argue, we will always disagree, but we will always love each other. And I know they love me. But I also know that about people in this church. Unfortunately, because I live so far away, I don't get to be here as much as a lot of other people. And because I am working out with couples in crisis, I'm not here as much as other folks like John. So I don't get to know as many of you as John gets to. And Terry and David and others, because I'm just not as close by. But I know this because I have, in the year and a half or so that I've been part of this church, our shepherds, among others, whenever I've had struggles and trials, have come to my side and said, let us help you with this. Let us help you with that. I'm sure there are times when they're frustrated with me, times when preachers are always frustrated with elders. It's in the contract. But I know they love me. And for those of you that I've gotten to know in the church, I've had the same view of you. So will we always agree? No. Will we sometimes get aggravated with each other? It's a given. We're brothers and sisters. But we will take care of each other. We will come to each other's aid. We will stand to each other's side. And that's my view of this church. That's who I believe you are. That's what I've seen, not just in coming when I need assistance, but for other people in this church who've gone through so much pain and so much agony that you have gone to their side, stood with them, been there for them. That's what this church is. So it's not perfect, but it's full of love. So, here's how we end today. In our closing song, if there's somebody who's done something in this church that's benefited you, or that you know they've done something for somebody else, during our closing song, just before our closing prayer, why don't you just walk over to him or her and say, thank you for what you did for me when you did blank, or thank you for what you did for Charlie, or thank you for what you did for Mary, and let's just end doing that. Okay? And you can actually do it while we're singing. Terry? We'll stand up.
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend, who would have thought that a lamb could rescue the souls of men?